Good afternoon. Here is the session that all of you were waiting for. The world according to President Trump. Very quickly, the speakers, or about the subject maybe first. Is the threat in the White House, as one of the famous newspapers in New York said, is he a threat to NATO, as the same paper said, or is he the authentic voice of the majority of Americans who couldn't care less about the Middle East or other parts of the world? To give us an answer, we have Jane Harman, president of the Wilson Institute, 9 terms congresswoman, David Petraeus, commander of 2 coalitions which fought in the Middle East, Central Command and director of CIA, Stanley Fischer, who served on 3 very important major financial institutions, the IMF, the Bank of Israel, and the Federal Reserve. Igor Yurgens, on my right, chairman of the management board of the Institute for Contemporary Development and member active in the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and to which also François Heisbourg on the right, far right, not political opinion, but just on the physical setting of the panel this afternoon, and also a senior advisor to the same institute and the FRS, Fondation de Recherche Stratégique, and the last one is our INSS leader, executive director, Amos Yadlin. The same question to all the panelists. This is going to be done according to military drills and exercises. Same question to all panelists, starting from the left this time. 2 minutes each, and I hope that all of you respect that. What was, in your view, the most destabilizing decision to the global order the US president took in 2018? Stanley.
Well, there's a problem in deciding when the president took these decisions, since some of them happened in 2017. But let me start. I think the basic problem was that he made a decision to break the traditional arrangements of the United States with its allies and to break the system that the United States had set up after World War II. And when I say that, I mean the system of military agreements and the system of economic agreements that had been made and provided the framework in which current transactions were being carried out. And the problem was that was all done without another plan. It was not accept anything that President Obama had done, which wasn't a very coherent way of proceeding. I used to be at MIT. I learned a lot from Professor Charles Kindleberger, who said that the world economy, or the world, does not work without a hegemon. The United States was that hegemon. It seems that the current president of the United States does not want to be the hegemon. And then the question is, what will we see instead? Will we see chaos, or will we see China as a hegemon? And that's a decision that he's halfway to making. And we are going to see what the trade agreement with China will be pretty soon, I suppose. And if it's an easy agreement, then he's made the decision, I think, that the United States is handing over to half the world, at least, to China, and possibly 20 years later, most of the world to China. That was the decision that was the most destabilizing to global order that he's taken so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane?
Thank you, and thank you to my dear friend Amos Yadlin for including me in this conference and teaching me so much about security in this part of the region. And I have to say, Amos, the last panel and the little that I've seen since arriving in Israel 3 hours ago tells me, so take pity on me when I fade out, tells me that I have so much more to learn, that the generational difference here is huge, and the generational difference among Jews in the United States in their perceptions of Israel is huge. And I'm an oldie. I have to learn from my granddaughter, my oldest, who will be bat mitzvahed in 2 months. I don't know what she thinks. I haven't asked her. On this topic, the world according to Trump, I'm not sure there is a world according to Trump unless it is Trump. I think you have to start there, that whatever he wants to do is the world. And I will read, just let me mention 2 things that have happened lately and describe one, quoting from a very good op-ed by Dan Shapiro. The words he uses about Trump's policy on Syria are impulsive, isolationist, transactional, turning on a dime with no alternative in place. And so I would say one of the destabilizing actions recently has been this decision with no support in his own administration or anywhere else that I can see except from Erdogan in Turkey to withdraw precipitously from Syria. One of our, and I'm sure Dave has more to say, one of our very successful current military strategies. So that would be one. But the one I want to focus on for 30 seconds is the impulsive decision to cause our government to be shut down, which obviously had local implications, horrible local implications. A third of the workforce of the Wilson Center in Washington was furloughed, so-called furloughed, unpaid, although some of them had to come to work. Our security people at airports, our air control system were essential personnel, unpaid. I mean, it was colossally dangerous inside the United States. But what it showed the world, and I think this has enormous security implications, is that the U.S. White House and the U.S. Congress are dysfunctional. And that is a very, very scary thought.
Thanks, David.
Well, first of all, thanks, Amos, for another great gathering, and congratulations to you and your team and for all that INSS does. I would just start off by offering something that I often offer to foreign audiences, and that is when you're trying to come to grips with, if you will, the world according to Trump, you certainly should read the tweets. These are the unedited communications of the commander-in-chief of the world's still reigning superpower. But then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. And you sometimes find out it's a bit different. I would contend, for example, that NATO, believe it or not, is actually better off under President Trump than it was under his predecessor. First of all, the U.S. is spending vastly more on defense, twice as much as all the other NATO nations, so it matters what we spend. We have troops that went into the Baltics, largely continuing policies that President Obama set in place, but in many cases actually advancing them weapons to Ukraine that weren't approved previously. When it comes to the destabilizing component of this, look, I think you can never go wrong by doubling down on what Stan Fischer says. And in this case, I might make it a tiny bit, with respect, a bit more nuanced. I think there's a certain ambivalence about continued U.S. leadership of the rules-based international order, which obviously includes not just the economic components, but but a variety of other international institutions and norms. Again, it's an ambivalence, though. On some days, clearly, it's America first. We want to withdraw from the world. We want to get out of Syria, out of Afghanistan, whatever else, and so forth. But then on other days, you have Vice President Pence all but declaring a new Cold War, in this case, on China. This is very significant, by the way. This is not a trivial development. This is the most important relationship in the world, and the consequences and implications of this now, again, seeming new Cold War are very, very significant for all of the world, not just for our two great nations. But the question is the U.S. going to do this on its own, or as Stanley noted, is it going to do it, is it going to have allies and partners? Can the G7 be brought back on board? NATO, will we value, again, allies and partners if indeed you're going to stand up to a country that has given the rest of the world some reason, again, for certain grievances. So I think that's the issue at hand here. It really is about whether the U.S. is going to continue to lead, and if so, it's going to continue to lead with others alongside as it now embarks on a quite new policy with respect to the world's other superpower.
Thanks, David. Igor?
Thank you very much, Amos. Thanks for invitation. Thanks for giving me the mic. In 2 minutes, from the Russian standpoint, I would pick, if I have to pick only one disastrous decision, it's INF treaty. The decision of the American administration and Mr. Trump to get out of the intermediary nuclear force treaty is the beginning of dismantling of the 30 years old system of bilateral and multilateral decisions on disarmament in general. So if by 21, which is the rumor now in Moscow, we get out of SALT agreement, START agreement, INF agreement, there is no system of controlling the nuclear arms. There will be a new tit for tat. And when we ask, for example, our commanders to stay in the regime in spite of Americans getting out of it, they say, how can we betray our Chinese friends? Because the decision was not only against Russians, but also against Chinese who started to develop the same intermediary nuclear force. So at the moment, due to this decision, we're in a very dangerous situation in Europe. I guess we are more or less on the same page with Macron, Merkel, and others in Europe, because we really went through very serious crisis in the mid-80s when we finally decided to get out of the build-up of the intermediary nuclear force. And I would say that alongside with some other things which we will discuss tomorrow, he pushed us to a more dangerous world than before.
Yeah, thank you. So we have China, we have Syria, we have INF. Amos, do you surprise us? I will be the last. Oh, you want to be the last? Okay. François.
My answer is going to be starburst. Let me explain that. There was a G7 meeting in Canada. We're talking about 2018.
Right.
There was a G7 meeting in Canada at which you had this extraordinary scene in which Donald Trump throws a couple of starburst candies at Angela Merkel and tells her in a not very kind voice, "Don't tell me I never give you anything, Angela." Why is this important? Aside from the fact that it is rather unusual for a head of state to express himself in such a way vis-à-vis somebody who is not supposed to be an enemy. And even vis-à-vis an enemy, you actually do tend to show greater respect. It's better, in Trump's world, it's better to be Kim Jong-un than to be the head of an allied state. Trump has a vision. He doesn't have a strategy. I disagree with those who say Trump is only Trump. Of course, he is indeed Trump. But he has a vision, and it's a vision of a world without allies. He doesn't understand what an ally is. He doesn't understand what an alliance means. His world is purely transactional, and that is indeed why it is better to be Kim Jong-un than to be Bibi Netanyahu, or to be Angela Merkel, or to be Emmanuel Macron, and so on. At that G7 meeting, from the accounts given by the participants, there were 3 organizations which Trump held in particular disdain and which he promised to destroy. And I use strong words because that was the reality of the situation. One is the G7. That's well on its way, by the way. The second one is NATO. And you've read the stories, which unfortunately are true, in the New York Times of the last few days, about how he has been playing with the idea of withdrawing the United States from NATO, and how the House of Representatives felt compelled a few days ago to actually hold a vote in which the House of Representatives tries to give itself the powers to prevent Donald Trump from withdrawing from NATO. That's where we are with Donald Trump. That is deeply destabilizing. Now, of course, Jane already mentioned Syria, but otherwise I would have started with Syria, the Syrian decision. But the Syrian decision for me is important because it tells us 2 things. One is that it tells us that talking with a dictator can be followed very quickly by a Twitter message saying, "We're out." And this could apply to South Korea. I would not be surprised if American forces left South Korea in 2019 or 2020. It could apply to NATO, as it is applying now to American forces in Syria. And the other thing, of course, was the removal of Jim Mattis. If NATO has done well, David, last year, it was not because of Trump. It was because of the 2 M's. One is Mattis, the other is Mueller. Mattis because he actively tried to beef up NATO, and very successfully so. He is much respected and admired in Europe. And the other is Mueller because he is depriving, for the time being, President Trump of the ability to have that kind of telephone conversation with President Putin of the sort that he had with Erdogan.
Okay. Amos, last one on this round.
Yeah, when we sat in this room last year, the concerns about Trump were huge. Basically about going to war. You know, the maximum pressure on Korea seems like the beginning of going to war. The South China Sea seems like it's going to clash between Americans and Chinese. So when I look at 2018, in the bottom line, what I found encouraging, that tweeting is not killing anyone. Tweeting is not sending aircraft carrier to places and not arming nuclear missiles. So we avoided the war in North Korea. We avoided the war with China. You avoided the war with China. The attack on Iran haven't come, even though he withdrew from the JCPOA. And even Russia, with Ukraine and some other aggressive moves towards Ukraine and NATO, was not, we haven't seen a reaction, a kinetic reaction. So this is the good news about 2018. That a lot of speaking, a lot of surprising policy, somebody who decide without listening to his advisors. On the contrary, he is more interested in the policy than in shaping the policy or understanding the realities, the real choices, the tensions, the history. No, he has an agenda, and he is going for that. Sometimes it's very dangerous, but I think that until the end of 2018, we were more blessed that most of the nightmares that we have a year ago haven't materialized.
Interesting point of view, somewhat balancing the 5 first speakers. I'm going now to particular questions. And question number 1, as the US president eroded the US deterrence, enabling rogue states, some of them were mentioned already, to continue with their nuclear plans. We have two speakers on this. David, you start. Short, concise.
Sure. Look, deterrence is founded on an adversary's perceptions of your capabilities and your will. We're talking about two would-be nuclear powers. Iran has seen the United States use force twice in Syria. We didn't have a red line moment as we had there before. There is a degree of maximum pressure that you can, again, argue about. But I tend to think that Iran looks at the United States and has to wonder whether or not this president might be willing to use force, perhaps a bit more than they would have worried about that with his predecessor. And the capabilities are as robust as ever when it comes to this as a former U.S. Central Command commander. With respect to North Korea, again, it's a little bit different, but at the very least, the meeting resulted in a cessation of the missile testing and the nuclear testing by North Korea. It certainly hasn't ended the North Korean threat, as was proclaimed. There may be additional sites that are out there. We don't even have a blueprint or an understanding of what those are, much less an on-the-ground inventory, much less an irreversible, complete denuclearization. But again, I think that there was so much concern because of the rhetoric that Amos recalled that indeed that did scare probably China even more than it scared North Korea. And the truth is the target of this was China, because it's China from which the umbilical cord runs to North Korea, with well over 90% of the trade to and from the Hermit Kingdom, and literally keeps the lights on in Pyongyang. So it got China's attention. It also generated some dynamics with South Korea and Japan that were very worrisome to China. And so again, I think there's the deterrence is quite strong. Again, coming back to the fact that it's based first and foremost on a sense of will of the other side.
Amos?
Yeah, deterrence is much more difficult against building the force than operating it. So the American deterrence vis-a-vis the bad guys on their operation is quite high. The North Koreans are very careful. The Iranians are very careful. Because America has the most formidable military and nuclear power, so they are acting very carefully. However, on building the force, on developing missiles, nuclear bombs in North Korea, and maybe in Iran, the deterrence is much more weak because of the will component. And the Americans are saying, and here Obama and Trump are on the same page, that all the options on the table, but it's not a credible sentence. Everybody reading that America is unwilling to use force, and America is using other element of national power, which is diplomatic and sanctions and economic. And they're using it all over the world against Iran and North Korea, as you ask about proliferation, but also against Russia and China on other issues. So in a way, there is here, vis-a-vis Iran, which is our main concern, a division of labor. The Americans are doing sanction and economic pressure, and they leave the Israelis the kinetic pressure. You don't see it yet on the nuclear issue, because Iran is behaving well, and we'll come to it later on. But on the non-conventional Iran activity, which is very, very negative, millennium, the Americans basically doing nothing, and this is very similar to the Obama behavior. Obama justified it with the need to keep the nuclear deal. So he was not intent to irritate the Iranians. When you look at Secretary Pompeo, 12 demands, you wonder why America is doing nothing about it and leaving all the activity to Israel.
But again, the question was nuclear deterrence, not malign activity and all the other
Yeah.
activities. Again, because I don't want, there should be no doubt, I don't think, about this administration in particular taking action were Iran ever to approach the threshold of a nuclear weapon. And again, that's what I was addressing with my question about deterrence.
I hope we will not be there in 2019.
I certainly hope so too, and I think Iran again would be ill-advised
because then I think
to do that.
I think Jerusalem will look to Washington and say, hey, David have said that we will do something. And the president promised. And the president will look to the prime minister and say, you know, I'm not Obama. It's not a red light. It's a green light. Go ahead.
Interesting question. To what extent Trump policies on certain issues are a continuation of a process or a trend started by Obama? To David and to Igor, are Russia and China better off with the policies on regional issues like the Middle East, for example, under Obama or under Trump? Certainly in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. Igor?
We had an illusion that Trump is a very bosom friend of Mr. Putin. I don't know what Mueller will finally say to you American guys, and then you will make your own decisions. But we had a euphoria that Trump and Putin are bosom friends and they can do business. But American system is much more sophisticated than some of our calculations, and Trump was not allowed to get into this friendship with Mr. Putin. At the moment, we're much more in a much more difficult situation. And some of the conspirology would say, okay, getting out of Syria, he gets us, Russians, involved even more. Getting us more into the Middle East makes a first step or second step already into overextension of Russian capabilities in general. Because we're a formidable nuclear force, we're a formidable military force, but we're not superpower economically. So that's what happened to the Soviet Union, getting involved into Afghanistan and then having a lot of difficulties pulling out and draining the resource. So you can think about Syrian decision of Mr. Trump in one way, but you can think of it as in another way too. So from this point of view, if I compare Obama and Trump, Obama and Kerry were the, you know, just a heaven gift to us compared to what we have in Bolton and Trump. So my question is negative.
I'm not so sure whether one should attribute so much sophistication to Trump, but interesting.
Look, I think with respect to Russia, it's a mix. I think Russia is seen as having, in a sense, prevailed in Syria. It certainly was the country that did the most to stabilize Bashar al-Assad when he was at a very sensitive time, and its air power and special ops and so forth, I think really tipped the balance. Having said that, as you mentioned, Igor, economically, the sanctions continue to bite as a result of the aggression in the Donbass and in Crimea. This administration gave the Ukrainians something the previous administration would not give them, which is shoulder-launched anti-tank guided missiles, which I, for one, don't see as offensive at any way. You're not going to run to Moscow with these things on your shoulder, but you certainly can make frontline tanks pay a very heavy price if they push further towards, say, the port of Mariupol or something like that out of the Donbass. And then again, some other areas where, again, I think it's a bit of a mix. And obviously all of this takes place in an era when oil prices have gone down very considerably from where they were in the heyday of $110 per barrel, now somewhere, of course, in the neighborhood of 60. China, in the last 2 years, has continued its extraordinarily impressive growth. Of course, it's now celebrating 40 years since Deng Xiaoping opened China to the world. There's a fabulous display of this in their National Museum. I was there back for a week in December. They continued fairly assertive activity at sea with the Belt and Road Initiative in a variety of other areas, and certainly in some diplomatic areas as well. But I think what is most significant with respect to China is what, in a sense, its actions have precipitated, which is the trade war with the United States, and a very serious backlash, where you see countries in Europe uniting against use of Huawei and the 5G. So you now have a technology war going on, if you will, and this is all based on very significant concerns about high technology being used as sort of a Trojan horse to get into, and we see the case in Poland where a Polish intelligence official, of course, was recruited by somebody apparently in the employ of Huawei, which underscores the challenges. That is a very big deal, because you could see a reaction to supply chains of high-tech goods that start in China and are no longer going to be allowed to sell to to Western Europe, to the US, and to a number of other countries. You could almost see two internets at some point in time, one that will obviously emanate from the West, but will exclude perhaps some Chinese-made tech, and then one that is started where it's protected by the Great Firewall of China, and then its Belt and Road partners. That should be a huge concern to China at a time when it's already inevitably starting to slow down and worrying about whether it can escape the so-called middle income trap and these other challenges that are out there for a country that has developed as rapidly as it has, but is then going to struggle to continue that kind of pace. And I think that's a very, very significant issue for China.
Since we are on China already, to Stanley and to Jane, is Trump totally wrong in the aggressive policy he takes towards China, given the balance, the trade balance between China and the United States, $500 billion deficit, or close to it? Is he totally wrong, Stanley?
He's almost totally wrong. First of all, the United States deficit vis-a-vis China is not 500 billion. That's
350.
Or even a bit less. It's the 500 billion is the
Total
deficit on goods, but on services, the United States has a significant surplus. And so the total is less than that. I think that this is a way of getting the Chinese to stop some of the measures they're taking, including those of, I don't know what the right word is, getting technology transfers in an unusual way. Is that theft?
Diplomatically said. Diplomatically said.
Well, David, you said it, not me. Something had to be done about that, and it's been done. Or at least it's been threatened to be done. So yes, there is something there. But what he's done is opened the door to a terrible trade system. Once you start using tariffs on particular goods to run the world's trade, you're in a different world in which you've organized a world in which corruption is the main method of getting changes in the tariff structure. And we've been through that. We went through that in the 60s, and we went through that in the 70s, not in the United States. I assume not in Israel, but certainly in other parts of the world. It doesn't work, it's not efficient, and it's not a good idea. So he'll get short-run results. I don't think he'll get long-run results, and he's going to build a trade system which we took a very long time to dismantle, starting in the 60s and 70s. And so, as with many things, he's got a short-run solution, and he doesn't have a long-run solution, and the day will come when it has to all be reversed, and at that stage we'll say, why did we ever do that? And, well, we'll have a discussion on that here, if we may, Amos. Thank you very much.
Jane?
Well, I think Trump is right on the theft of intellectual property. I think the Obama administration was too timid, and Trump is right. Having said that, he's using a sledgehammer and not a scalpel, not only against China, but against countries like Canada, where he's invoking national security concerns as a justification for putting tariffs on Canadian goods, not realizing that cross-border trade is the way our auto industry, as an example, will stay healthy into the future. But let me make a more broad, I hate to do this sitting next to Stanley because he knows so much more than I ever will. But I think our asymmetric strength in the United States is our economic power. And we don't use it as well as we should. We're still talking about kinetics and we're still talking about nuclear deterrence, but our sanctions have been colossally effective in deterring bad behavior. I'd say more effective at the moment than nuclear deterrence. Also want to add something to the mix, and it does relate to economics, and that is cyber and influence operations and the new tools of warfare, which I would say could be and maybe are much more dangerous at the moment than nuclear tools.
Thank you. François, I didn't prepare you for this question, but do you want to give the European view of the trade wars?
Yeah, I definitely would. And if you hadn't asked me, I would have asked you. If I can put it that way.
It was preemptive.
It was said earlier on that Trump is not a great strategist. And when you look at the handling of the trade dossier, this comes across very clearly. When Trump started gunning after China, and although there was, his approach was, how to put it, I'll speak less diplomatically than Stanley, his approach was primitive. That is, he was emphasizing tariffs rather than intellectual property rights. But still, you know, maybe for the wrong reason, he was actually trying to do the right thing. That got resonance in Europe. And although Europe may be, as some would think, in terminal decline, that we're going nowhere, and so on, the fact is that we are the largest trading bloc in the world. And therefore, whether we play with the US or against the US in trade terms makes a hell of a difference, particularly if you're trying to take on China. So when Trump started this in March of last year, there were feelers from Brussels. I say Brussels because trade is actually an EU competence. It's not a national competence. There were feelers sent out to Washington. But of course, in a Trumpian world, any form of engagement is always read as a sign of weakness. And any sign of weakness in the Trumpian world has to be punished. So what does Trump do? Instead of saying, yeah, let's gang up on China together and we'll press the pips until they squeak. He slapped on tariffs on EU steel and EU aluminum. Now, was this smart? You betcha. And if we are now in Europe starting to take measures against predatory Chinese practices in terms of intellectual property rights and cyber, which David rightly pointed out, it is certainly not in the framework, alas, of a partnership with the US. We're doing this despite the US, because our interests are being challenged by China, and we rise up to defend our interests. But this is definitely not something we're doing with our American friends. This is how bad it gets under Trump. That is, even when he has the right instinct, he manages to turn everybody off. Just a word, Jane, you mentioned the strength of sanctions. And you are right. I measured this in China last June when there was a discussion between Iranians, Europeans, Chinese, Americans, non-official Americans, of course, on how we would handle the post-JCPOA situation with Iran. And the Chinese made it very clear, we're not going to do anything crazy in terms of trading with Iran because we're deathly afraid of American secondary sanctions. So yes, this stuff works. The problem is that it works so well that in 20 years, there will no longer be an American-dominated monetary and financial system because the incentive for the Chinese and for the Europeans to build up, by hook or by crook, some alternative system will simply be too great. It's not simply a second Chinese-dominated internet. It may well be a Chinese-dominated monetary and financial system. But that's 20 years. And the Chinese for 20 years is like 20 days for us. They do not reason along the same timelines.
Thank you, François. Let's zoom. We have less than half an hour. Let's zoom on the Middle East. To Amos, to David, and to Jane. Is Trump totally wrong from the US point of view in pulling out from the Middle East? And can some of the allies, traditional allies of the United States in the Middle East, survive in the absence of the United States from the region? Amos.
Yeah, I will do it from the Israeli perspective, not from the American perspective. I will use my 5 rules, the Yadlin rules. Never panic, never be in euphoria, be slightly paranoid. There is no silver bullets, and there is no prophets around. You cannot see the future. However, you should try and predict it, but it's not a prophet.
In this country, to discount prophecy?
So now, the no panic part of it. Israel was in panic because the US left Syria. And I said on every TV channel, don't be in panic, because the Americans haven't stopped the Iranians in Syria. Their only authority was to shoot ISIS, and not Iranians. And they haven't done anything to stop the Iranians. So no panic, it is our job, and we will do it. Second, are they really slightly paranoid? Are they really leaving the Middle East? I'm not sure. I see a huge air base in Qatar. I see their forces in Incirlik in Turkey. I see the Sixth Fleet still sailing in the Med. So the fact that the Americans decided not to do another war on the ground with boots on the ground, with unfortunately bodies coming back to the US with American soldiers, is not necessarily a bad decision. It's basically the will of the American people not to see another war. After 2 wars, you know, we think that 33 days is a long war. 50 days, unacceptable. 17 years, 18 years in Afghanistan, 8 years in Iraq, and how many trillions? So the Americans don't want to fight another stupid war in the Middle East, because Americans want to fight wars if they can see a very positive result. And there are not positive results here. So from Israeli point of view, we are not asking the Americans to shed any blood for us, any blood. We do want you to continue and have some interest in the Middle East, not with soldiers, but with diplomatic power. We need you very much in the UN Security Council. We need you very much in your diplomatic support, in your security support, but we will do the job. And in a way, it's make Israel much more important in the Middle East, since the US is not here. And we had a panel this morning about the Saudis. They used to have a contract with America. We give you oil and you give us security. America doesn't need oil anymore, and they don't want to supply security, so maybe there is a market opportunity for Israel. So the next point, and this will be the last point, I was very worried from the way they have done it, because they haven't deserted Israel as an ally. They have deserted the Kurds and some other important people who have done the war with them. And they also paid with thousands of Kurds that were killed in the fight against ISIS. And to leave them alone to the mercy of the Turks, or Assad, which is, I don't know what is worst. Maybe for the Kurds, the Turk is worst. But Assad is not what the Kurds are deserved after fighting shoulder with the Americans.
Amos, I fully agree with you. I'm not so sure. I mean, if I combine your answer on the Iranians, when you said that Israel is now projecting the power, and now the Turks are projecting the American power in the Middle East, is that a substitute to being here? America, US is using proxies, Israel and Turkey, for certain purposes. Interesting question, David.
Well, look, I just don't agree with what you just implied. The US has huge bases all up and down the Gulf states, and then contingency bases in a variety of other countries in the region. It's in Kuwait, it's in Bahrain in a huge way, it's in the UAE, it's in Qatar, again in other places, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere from those bases. So the US is in the Mideast. The real question is, what about the withdrawal from Syria that has been announced, and then what about this desire to draw down in Afghanistan, or perhaps even leave Afghanistan if there is a peace agreement with the Taliban? And here I think it's always good to come back to the objectives that you have. It seems to me that in Syria the objective number one is the enduring defeat of ISIS. It's not enough just to finish them off in the couple of villages they have left. You have to keep them down. We know what happens if you take your eye off an extremist group. That's how ISIS was able to reconstitute itself in Iraq after our combat forces were withdrawn from there, and Prime Minister Maliki pursued ruinous sectarian practices. The second is we have to ensure that Iran is not able to establish a ground line of communications from Tehran through Iraq, through Syria, and down to the southern Lebanon. And this is crucial. And by the way, we have a base at Al-Tanf, right on the border between Iraq and Syria. I know this base really well. It's one of the 2 official crossings into Syria. And if we pulled out of that, I guarantee you that that would be used in some fashion. So that's actually very, very important, how we maintain some presence, even if it's on the other side of the border there. And then the third is, as Amos said, what about those who have been doing the fighting on the ground? We've, yes, been supporting them, advising them, enabling them from the air, but they have been on the front lines fighting and dying. And what about the political arrangement that can allow them a degree of autonomy, certain rights, and all the rest of that? And obviously, I have concerns if you withdraw completely, how you would ensure those objectives. Certainly, there are various schemes. You move from Al-Assad Air Base in western Anbar province and a variety of other things, and again, some solution to Al-Tanf. But again, these are issues that folks are grappling with right now, as you would imagine. With respect to Afghanistan, we went to Afghanistan for a reason. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned, and the training was conducted initially. When al-Qaeda had a sanctuary there under Taliban rule at that time, it was tolerated. We stayed for a reason, to ensure they could not reestablish that sanctuary, and they have tried repeatedly, including when I was privileged to be the commander in Afghanistan, and then later as a CIA director, and ISIS has an affinity for that location as well. Again, how do you do this without forces on the ground? Are you going to accept a promise from the Taliban that they're not going to allow? Do they even have the power to prevent it, even if they sought not to allow it? And by the way, don't forget that Afghanistan is also the so-called platform for our regional counter-terrorist activities, which are very important, and I would contend are as important to Russia as they are to all the Central Asian states. They're former republicans. They don't want to see extremism spread through Afghanistan and ultimately into Russia. They have enough problems, and they don't need any more opium from Afghanistan either. So again, in each case, how do you achieve the objectives that we know exist in these places without some presence? Perhaps there is some artful way of doing that, but I'd have to see that to ensure that that's present.
Thank you. Jane?
Well, first, I think it's a political fact that in the United States there's war fatigue. And to remind, President Obama and President Trump ran for office saying they would get us out of these endless wars in the Middle East. Obama was not successful, and we'll see whether Trump is more successful. With respect to Afghanistan, I agree with Dave that we went there for a reason. The resolution to authorize military force there was debated and passed the U.S. Congress. I was there. I voted for it with only one dissent, only one. So it was 434 to 1. And that's a 534 to 1, only one dissent in either chamber. That's a pretty good margin in the dreams of the present Congress. And I think our mission in Afghanistan has been uneven, but I want to at least give some credit to Zal Khalilzad, who is Afghan-born, a very capable diplomat, who is our emissary, or whatever his title is now, who announced today that there's a new framework. And if it is possible, and Dave knows this on a much more granular level, but if it is possible for the Taliban and the Afghan government to work together against the terror threat, well, hey, that's a good thing. Iraq is different, and Iraq has destabilized the region. Again, I then in Congress voted for the war effort in Iraq based on, as we now know, false intelligence. The intelligence was wrong, and I say my vote was wrong. That doesn't mean that Saddam Hussein was worthy, does not. But I think for a variety of reasons, that has complicated everything else the U.S. has done in the region, not for the better, again, despite heroic efforts by U.S. and other leaders. But are we withdrawing from the region? I would say we can't withdraw. It's not just the military commitments, but let's understand where we are, at least Americans, or this American. I'm in a country that my ancestors dreamed about. Lots of them were lined up and shot in the back in a pit in Poland. And the ones who survived made their way in America. My father became a very successful medical doctor. Or some of them got here. And I just don't think there's any possible way ever, despite our differences, that the United States will abandon its commitment to the existence of Israel. And so that's one. But two, I think that there are huge dangers in the region based on the possibility of miscalculation. And we didn't discuss this yet. If for any reason Iran, which is at the moment not advancing its nuclear prowess, if it does, then we know the Saudis will collect the bomb they've already bought from, or allegedly bought from, Pakistan. And there could be a nuclear arms race here, let alone, you know, the use of proxies in an even more damaging way than they are used now by various countries. So I think that if that happens, I know, Amos, that Israel can take care of itself. But I don't think so if we're talking, you know, huge, big-time, big-scale nuclear war. And I think the U.S. would be drawn into that. And I just remind that 100 years ago, November 11th, 2018, was the end of World War I, which most people think was based on a miscalculation and which was the bloodiest war in world history.
We are not talking nuclear war. We are talking preventing nuclear bomb in Iran. It's not a nuclear war.
Yep. We used to say in the Israeli army that every plan is a basis for changes. So here's the change in the whatever I wrote to you. And the last, we come to the last question. We have less than 15 minutes to discuss maybe the crux of the matter, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian. It's not the crux, but the end of this panel. And different from what I wrote to you, let's have everyone on the panel say something. 2 minutes each. I know it's difficult. Stanley, is the deal of the century relevant, important?
Well, if the deal of the century solves the Israeli-Palestinian problem, it's worth it, yes. But will what we're seeing now, which is, it looks to me very much like what I've seen, I don't know, I don't follow this stuff from inside, is a plan to give Israel both sides, give Israel up to the Jordan and let the Palestinians go wherever they might go. And that's what I'm seeing in the American newspapers. That will not work. With a very high probability it'll be a failure. And if it's a failure, it hasn't solved the problem. So yes, the deal of the century, if it solves the problem, is great. What they're doing and the way they're doing it, having a guy who doesn't, I mean, it's part of the modus operandi. A guy who doesn't know anything about a problem is put in to solve it. Brings fresh insights to each of these problems. But I don't see precisely how they're going to do this. I mean, the one hope I've heard from some people involved in the argument is, well, the Christians are leaving, the Christian Arabs are leaving the Middle East. Maybe they won't want to live in an Israeli-run West Bank, and they'll start leaving as well, and in the end, all will be well. Well, I don't think one wants to go to a solution like that. There probably won't be a solution. It'll be full of terrorism and all the things Israel has been trying to prevent. So I don't think the deal of the century, as currently described, is not going to work.
Jane?
Well, I too am not sure what it is or if we'll ever see it. I think there are many things going on in the United States, including the Mueller investigation, which could weaken the ability of the Trump administration to offer any such deal. But I want to go back to something François started with, which was, why would you throw away alliances if they can be helpful? And to remind us all, there was a Saudi proposal some years back, which is now the Arab proposal, which was a neighborhood all-in proposal, with the exception, obviously, of the Shia Iranians and Persians. But the way to solve this, the deal of the century, is an all-in deal. That's how the deal will last a century and not 5 minutes.
David?
Well, again, I don't know what the deal of the century is. I've actually visited the West Wing and didn't come away with a completely clear understanding. I did, to be fair, though, come away with a sense that folks have been very, very seriously engaged in this for the past 2 years. And, you know, their counter, by the way, Stan, to your point, was to say, well, how well have the experts done with this over the last 10 or 15 years? And there's something to that, sadly. Now, having said that, again, it's just inconceivable to me what deal would be acceptable to both sides, obviously with some significant compromises on either. And then it's just beyond me to imagine that the political leaders of either side could actually make the compromises, certainly not on the Palestinian side. He's in no position to do this, and we'll see what happens as a result of the elections here as well. So I think I might reiterate what I think I said last year on stage, was that I don't necessarily see this as a time to use a U.S. baseball analogy to swing for the home run to try to hit it over the fence. this might be a time to try to hit singles and doubles and try to pursue initiatives, which I think, by the way, INSS has put forward.
This is exactly what we did.
To put forward
Yes.
initiatives that could help set the conditions for that moment when the political leaders of each side would be feeling sufficiently strong to make the compromises that would be necessary to achieve the deal of the century.
Thank you for the analogy with the home run and the first base, second base. I think that this is...
I can explain that if you want.
I
Okay.
I can too. That's right.
I can find a soccer analogy or something.
It's also, you can take it from football instead of the
Hail
Hail Mary.
Mary. You got it. Okay, we're on it. We're on it.
Igor.
Well, Russia is back to the Middle East, no question about that. In our doctrine, we're playing on all fields now. We can be a balancing force. That's, I guess, the ideal which our president has in his mind, together with his diplomatic force and military force. Good relations with Iran, good relations with Turkey, good relations with the state of Israel, and of course, historical good relations with Palestinians, Syrians, and so on and so forth. So from this point of view, we're in a good position to help. And of course, Putin is criticized sometimes for absolutely just reasons, sometimes excessively. But one thing can be said, that we never had it so good with the Russia-Israel relationship than now. And he made a special effort, both inside of Russia, making, overtures to Jewish community, opening the museums, and so on and so forth, contributing personally to that. So from this point of view, he understands the role of Israel in the Middle East. He understands the role of Jewish community in Russian Federation. He understands many things in a very subtle way. From this point of view, I think that at this present stage, when Americans opened up a little bit of a vacuum for the Russians, you can rely on this azimuth, on this vector, and that can be exploited by you guys.
Thank you, Igor. Amos, you want to be the last? Okay. François, go ahead.
Yeah.
European view.
When I read, when I had this deal of the century expression under my eyes, I actually had to scratch my head 3 times to remember what this was about. Because, of course, when the words were used, I didn't take them seriously, and from everything that I've heard until now, it appears that I was quite right not to take the words seriously, so I forgot them. So deal of the century, forget it. This, in a sense, throws us back to the sort of first principle. The first principle is that nothing is going to happen if the Israelis and the Palestinians don't work it out between themselves. Can outsiders help? Of course they can. Russia can help politically. The Europeans can help politically and economically. Arab states may provide some support. The Iranians may be bludgeoned or pushed into some form of irrelevance if the Russians start getting nasty with their good friends in Syria. But I'm not holding my breath. My expectations, unfortunately, are as low as they were a year ago on this one.
Amos, let me...
I have 5 minutes.
No, I want to rephrase my question for you especially. Some of the speakers, I think all the speakers, and David made it certainly clear that maybe there is no deal, not of the century and not of the decade, in the sense that someone comes with a comprehensive deal, it doesn't work for now. Is there a way we can influence this deal before it's made and create certain series of deals which eventually get to the ultimate deal?
Okay. first deal of the century, deal of the decade, I think there is a lesson here. The deal should come in the first year of the president. Because if they start to study and they start to create deals, then they reach the midterm, and then there is election in Israel, and then the coming election is in the horizon. If you want to make a deal, or at least present a deal, do it in your first year. Otherwise, we have a prime minister that already exhausts 8 years of a president. So, and the Abu Mazen is not less capable of doing it. So go in the first year. Second, I think the West Wing can get a gold medal for keeping the secrets, the parameters. You know, you have been there, I've been there, we are two very good intelligence officers, and we got nothing from them, nothing. Even though from the question you understand what they are aiming to, but to their credit, they kept the secret. Third, as a citizen of Israel, I do pray that there will be a miracle. The deal of the century will appear, and Bibi and Abu Mazen will accept it. I'm going even to the synagogue every Shabbat and praying for the success. However, it's not a reform, it's not a conservative and not an orthodox in our village, so it's all of them together. But as an analyst, I think the gaps between the Israelis and the Palestinians cannot be bridged even by Trump. Cannot be bridged. In the foreseeable future, with these two leaders, with these two people, it cannot be bridged, unfortunately. However, we are not in panic. We have something to do. We have something to offer. Yeah, and where we want to go as Israelis, we want to go to a place where we have a Jewish, democratic, secure, and with the moral upper end. This is where we want to go. And what is Zionism is all about? You are not waiting for the Messiah. How you say Messiah? You are doing what you think is good to your people. So we will not have to wait for the Palestinian Messiah or to the Messiah that will take the Palestinians away. Both of them are not going to come. We are going to live with the Palestinians in this area, but we can shape the future of Israel and take the veto on the future of Israel from the Palestinians. And this is exactly the plan that Udi, who is already waiting there, will tell you about in a minute.
There is a break. We need to evacuate the room for half an hour for security checks before of the president. So please.
So I want to finish.
Finishing, and
I want to finish and saying that I'm not optimistic about the capability of reaching an agreement, but I'm very optimistic that after the election in Israel, and after Trump will come with his plan, and it will be rejected by both sides, there is a plan on the table that a real leader in Israel will take forward to make Israel Jewish, democratic, secure, with the moral upper hand, independently if we will not have a partner. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.